is Coach Ling from MTO, and this is the week 4 of the Recopy Newspaper Challenge. And continuing the Ukraine-Russia war series, today I will recopy an article named The Deafening Silence of Intellectuals in the Face of Growing Global Conflicts, nghĩa là sự im lặng giả tạo của giới trí thức khi mà đối mặt với cái sự gia tăng xung đột toàn cầu. Cái bài này thì nó rất là dài và đối với mình thì nó thực sự rất là phức tạp, nhiều từ vựng và cấu trúc câu cũng rất là khó hiểu. Lời văn thì rất là văn vẻ, cho nên là mình đã phải vận dụng tất cả mọi thứ từ Cambridge Dictionary rồi là Google dịch và nhờ đến sự trợ giúp của cô em gái thì mới hoàn thành được có 3/4 của bài báo thôi, còn 1/4 nữa nhưng mà cũng phải chép đến khoảng chắc phải mấy trang nữa mới hết, nên là không còn kịp thời gian thì mình sẽ kết thúc ở đây và sẽ dành phần tiếp theo cho tuần tới nhé. Và bây giờ thì mình xin phép được đọc bài báo. Perhaps the most incomprehensible silence is that of the intellectuals, and silence is nothing short of complicity with the massive war. Intellectuals do not have a monopoly on culture, on values, or on truth, much less on the meanings attributed to any one of these demands of the spirit, as it used to be termed. But intellectuals should also not shrink from denouncing what they see as destructive of culture, values, and truth, notably when such destruction claims to be carried out in the name of these demands of spirit. Intellectuals are not to refrain from saluting the sun before daybreak, but neither should they refrain from warning against the clouds ominously gathering in the sky before nightfall, preventing daylight from being enjoyed. Europe is witnessing an alarming re-emergence of two realities that are destructive of the demands of the spirit. The destruction of democracy brought about by the growth of political forces of the far right, and the destruction of the peace brought about by the naturalization of war. Both destructions are legitimized by the very values of each of them aims to destroy. Fascism is promoted in the name of democracy. War is promoted in the name of peace. All of this has become possible because the political initiative and presence in the media are being relinquished to conservative forces on the right and far right. Social protection measures aimed at making people feel both in their pockets and their daily existence that democracy is better than dictatorship are becoming ever more rare precisely because of the cost of the war in Ukraine and because of the economic sanctions against the enemy, which supposedly should be hurting their intended target, are in fact hurting above all the European people whose governments have allied themselves with the US. The destruction of peace and democracy is mostly affected by the unequal and parallel drawing of two circles of warranted freedoms of expression and freedoms of action endorsed by the political and media powers that be. The circle of freedoms granted in the case of progressive positions advocating for just and durable peace and more inclusive democracy is getting smaller and smaller, while the circle of freedoms granted in the case of conservative positions advocating for war and fascist polarization together with the neoliberal economic inequality does not cease to grow. Progressive commentators are increasingly absent from the major media outlets, while every week conservative ones present us with page after page of staggering mediocrity. History has taught us that in the periods immediately before the outbreak of wars, all politicians declare themselves against the war while contributing to it by virtue of their actions. Silence is nothing short of complicity with the master of war. Let us look at some of the main symptoms of this vast process currently underway. 1. The information war over the Russia-Ukraine conflict has so taken hold of public opinion that even commentators with the modicum of conservative common sense have submitted to it with sickening subservience. Here's one example among many from the European corporate media. During his weekly appearance on a Portuguese TV channel, SIC, on January 29, 2023, Luis Marques Mendes, a well-known commentator, usually a voice of common sense within the conservative camp, said something to this effect: Ukraine has to win the war because if it doesn't, Russia will invade the other European countries. This is pretty much what American television viewers hear from MSNBC's Rachel Maddow on a daily basis. Where does such an absurd idea come from, if not from an overdose of misinformation? Have they forgotten that post-Soviet Russia sought to join NATO and the EU but was rebuffed, and that, contrary to what had been promised to the former Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO expansion on Russia's borders may constitute a legitimate defense concern on the part of Russia, even if the invasion of Ukraine is indeed illegal, as I myself repeatedly denounced from day one. Don't they know that it was the US and the United Kingdom who boycotted the first peace negotiations shortly after the war broke out? Have the commentators not considered, even for a moment, that a nuclear power that finds itself faced with the possibility of defeat in a conventional conflict might resort to using its nuclear weapons, which in turn could lead a nuclear catastrophe? Don't they see that two nationalisms, one Ukrainian and the other Russian, are being exploited in the war in Ukraine to force Europe into total dependence on the US and to stop the expansion of China, the country with which the US is really at war? Don't the commentators realize that today's Ukraine is tomorrow's Taiwan? Curiously enough, no details are ever offered. In the midst of all this, a ventriloquistic propaganda favor regarding what a defeat of Russia will mean. Will it lead the ousting of Russian President Vladimir Putin, or to the balkanizing of Russia? 2. The anti-communist ideology that dominated the Western world until the 1990s is being surreptitiously recycled to promote anti-Russian hatred to the point of hysteria, even though it is a known fact that Putin is an autocratic leader, a friend of European right and far right. Russian artists, musicians, and outlets are being banned from events, even as courses on Russian culture and literature, which are no less European than French literature and culture, are being terminated in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, with its strategy of humiliating Germany after its loss during World War I. German writers were barred from attending the first meeting of the annual Pen Congress held in May 1923. The only dissenting voice was that of the Romain Rolland, who won the 1915 Nobel Prize for Literature. Despite everything he had written against the war and German war crimes in particular, Rolland had courage to say, "In the name of intellectual universalism, I will not subject my thinking to the tyrannical and demanded fluctuations of politics." 3. Democracy is being so emptied of meaning that it can be instrumentally defended by those who use it in order to destroy it. At the same time, those who serve democracy strengthen it against fascism. Fascism are labeled radical leftists. At the international level, the West unanimously applaud the 2014 events of Kiev's Maidan Square, which is where the currently war truly began, despite the fact that the flags of Nazi organizations were in plain sight during the protest. Despite the fact that popular rage was directed against a democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych then, and despite the fact that, according to write-ups, Victoria Nuland, the U.S. neoconservative and then Assistant Secretary of the State for European and Eurasian Affairs, had explicitly named the people who would wield power in case of victory, including an American citizen, Natalie Zaresko, who later served as Ukraine's new Minister of Finance from 2014 to 2016. Despite all these events, which amounted to well-orchestrated coup aimed at removing a pro-Russian president and turning Ukraine into a U.S. protectorate, were celebrated throughout the West and as a vibrant victory for democracy. In fact, none of this was quite as absurd as the fact that when Juan Guaido, a Venezuelan opposition figure, proclaimed himself interim president of Venezuela in a public square in Caracas in 2019, it was enough for the U.S. along with many EU countries to recognize him as such. In December 2022, the Venezuelan opposition itself put an end to this farce. 4. The double standard for assessing what happens in the world is taking on aberrant proportions and is being used in quasi-automatic fashion to strengthen the war apologists, stigmatize the parties the left, and normalize the fascists. Examples are legion, so difficulty lies in choosing among them. Let me offer just a couple of illustrations from the national and international context. In Portugal, the raucous and offensive behavior of members of Chega, the far-right party, is very similar to the behavior of the deputies of Germany's Nazi party from the moment they entered the Reichstag in the early 1920s. Attempts were made to stop them, but the political initiative belonged to the Nazi party and the economic situation was on their side. As early as May 1933, the Nazi Party held its first book burning in Berlin. How long will it be until it happens in Portugal? Largely backed by U.S. and counterinsurgency institutions, the position of today's global right vis-a-vis leftist government is that whenever the latter cannot be overthrown by subcorps, they must be worn down by accusations of corruption and forced to grapple with issues of governability so that they are prevented from strategically Strategically, it would appear that corruption in particular is confined to the Socialist Party, which secured an outright majority in the last election in 2022. In the eyes of the hegemonic conservative media, every minister in the Socialist Party government is presumed corrupt until proven otherwise. It shouldn't be hard to find similar examples in other countries. From the international context, I will mention two glaring examples. There is now a general consensus that the September 2022 explosion of the Nord Stream gas pipelines was the work of the U.S. and was allegedly overseen by President Joe Biden, a claim he denied, which was possibly assisted by allies. An incident of this magnitude should have been immediately investigated by an independent international commission. What seems obvious is that the aggrieved party, Russia, had no interest in destroying an infrastructure that they could make useless by just turning off the tap. On February 8, Seymour Hersh, a respected American journalist, used conclusive information to show that the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2 had in fact been planned by the US since December 2021. If that was indeed the case, we have before us in heinous crime that is also an act of state terrorism. The US, which claims to be the champion of global democracy, should be supremely interested in finding out what happened. Was this the only way to force Germany to join the war against Russia? Was the sabotaging of the gas pipelines intended to put an end to European policy initiated by former Chancellor of Germany Willy Brandt of being less energy dependent on the US? In the context of expensive energy and closed down businesses, was this not an effective way of putting the brakes on the EU's economic engine? Who benefits from the situation? Heavy silence hangs over this act of state terrorism. The other example of glaring double standards is the violence of the Israeli colonial occupation of Palestine, which is intensifying. Israel killed 35 Palestinians in January 2023 alone. In a raid carried out on January 26 in the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, Israel killed 10 people. One day later, a Palestinian youth killed 7 people outside the synagogue of a Jewish settlement in East Jerusalem, an area illegally occupied by Israel. There is violence on both sides of the conflict, but the disproportion is overwhelming, and many acts of terrorism by the State of Israel, sometimes committed with impunity by the settlers or by soldiers at checkpoints, do not even make the news. There are no Western media correspondents to report on what is happening in the occupied territories, which is where most of violence takes place, except for footage, cell phone footage, and we do not have gut-wrenching images of suffering and death on the Palestinian side. The international community and the Arab world have kept quiet on this matter. Despite the hugely disproportionate means of warfare, there is no movement to send effective military equipment to Palestine, as is currently the case with Ukraine. Why is Ukraine's a just residence, but Palestinian resistance is not. Europe, the continent where the Holocaust that killed millions of Jews took place, is ultimately at the root of the crimes committed against Palestine. But nowadays it shares the odious complicity with Israel. The EU is currently hurrying to create a court to try war crimes, but herein lies the hypocrisy. Only those committed by Russia, just as in the years leading up to World War I, the appeals to Europeanism, Pan-Europe, as it was called back then, are increasingly becoming calls to war and leading to rhetoric aimed at concealing the unjust suffering and the loss of well-being now being imposed on the European people without them having been consulted on the need for or advantages of the Russia-Ukraine war. Ok, mình sẽ tạm dừng ở đây. Còn một phần số 5 nữa mà mình chưa viết được và mình cũng sẽ không đọc tiếp theo, mình sẽ để dành cho tuần sau. Okay, thank you for watching and thank you for reading my terrible recopy. Goodbye, see you.